They banned me from the family business meetings like I was an embarrassment they needed to hide, like my presence polluted the room where real decisions were made. What made it worse wasn't the exclusion itself, it was the hypocrisy. Because behind closed doors, behind the polished smiles and self-righteous speeches, I was their most valuable client. Their blue chip, high revenue, keep the lights on client. They took my money without hesitation, but they refused to let me sit at the table where that money was discussed. The irony was almost insulting. I married into their family believing partnership meant respect, believing loyalty flowed both ways. I was wrong. I didn't understand then that some families don't see marriage as unity, they see it as access to your resources, your silence, your compliance. From the beginning, I noticed the subtle lines drawn around me. Conversations stopped when I entered the room. Financial discussions were postponed until later. Decisions were announced, never debated, especially not with me present. At first, I told myself it was temporary, that trust took time. I didn't want to be labeled difficult. I didn't want to be the outsider who complained. So I stayed quiet. That was my first mistake. The day I realized exactly where I stood came during a quarterly strategy meeting I wasn't invited to. I only found out because my husband casually mentioned it over dinner, mid-sentence, as if it were nothing. "Oh, by the way, we're meeting tomorrow morning to finalize the expansion plan." I looked up from my plate and asked, calmly, "Should I be there?" He hesitated. That hesitation told me everything. "It's more internal," he said carefully. Internal. I was married to him, my capital was invested in the company, my name was on contracts, but I wasn't internal enough. The next morning, while they sat around a polished table discussing growth and strategy, I sat in my office reviewing invoices that proved something they conveniently ignored. Over 40% of their annual revenue came from accounts I personally controlled. I wasn't just a client. I was their backbone. Still, they locked me out. When I confronted my mother-in-law later that week, she smiled the way people do when they believe they hold power. "It's not personal," she said. "We just think it's better to keep business discussions within the family." I almost laughed. I was family when it came to funding their ambitions, but not family enough to influence them. That was the moment something shifted inside me. Not anger. Awareness. I started paying closer attention. I listened instead of reacting. I watched patterns. Who spoke over whom? Who deferred? Who panicked when numbers dipped? I noticed how dependent they were on certain accounts, my accounts. I noticed how fragile their confidence became when projections didn't align. They underestimated me because I didn't demand a seat at the table. They mistook silence for ignorance. And that was their second mistake. I didn't rush to confront them again. I didn't threaten. I didn't announce my importance. I did something far more dangerous. I became patient. Over the next several months, I reorganized my portfolio quietly. I diversified contracts. I renegotiated terms, all within my rights, all completely legal. I stopped automatically renewing agreements that favored them disproportionately. I asked questions through intermediaries. I requested clarifications that exposed inefficiencies they had buried for years. Every move I made was subtle, reasonable, impossible to accuse. Meanwhile, they continued excluding me, convinced they had control. At family dinners, they talked freely about the business, assuming I wasn't paying attention. They complained about pressure, about cash flow, about how one lost client could destabilize everything. They never once realized they were speaking to that client. The day the first contract change hit their books, panic rippled through the company. It wasn't dramatic. Just a quiet discrepancy. A number that didn't align with expectations. They called emergency meetings. Meetings I still wasn't invited to. I heard about them afterward, secondhand, always minimized. Just routine adjustments, my husband said. I nodded. Inside, I was already 3 steps ahead. They tried to compensate by chasing smaller clients, stretching resources, making rushed decisions. Every choice exposed how little strategic depth they actually had. The more they scrambled, the clearer it became. They didn't ban me from meetings because I lacked insight. They banned me because they feared it. And fear, when ignored, turns into downfall. By the time my mother-in-law finally requested a private conversation, her tone had changed. Less confidence. More calculation. She asked if I would consider being more flexible with my contracts. I smiled politely and said I'd think about it. That night, I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I sat quietly and acknowledged the truth I had been avoiding. This wasn't about business anymore. This was about power, respect, and the cost of underestimating the wrong person. They thought banning me would weaken me. They thought keeping me out would keep them safe. What they didn't know was that every door they closed forced me to build leverage elsewhere. And when leverage matures, it doesn't knock. It dismantles. By the time they realized something was seriously wrong, the damage had already moved beyond anything they could reverse with emergency meetings or forced smiles. The problem wasn't just that money was tightening. It was that the certainty they had lived on, the belief that they were untouchable, was dissolving. I watched it happen from a distance they had created themselves. The irony wasn't lost on me. They had pushed me out of the room to protect their authority, and in doing so, they removed the only person who truly understood the scale of their vulnerability. My husband started coming home later than usual, his confidence eroding in small, telling ways. He'd loosen his tie as soon as he walked in, pace the living room before sitting, speak in half sentences that never quite landed. At first, he didn't connect the dots. He talked about suppliers demanding stricter terms, about lenders asking uncomfortable questions, about internal disagreements that were suddenly turning heated. I listened without offering solutions. Not because I didn't have them, but because I wanted him to feel the weight of exclusion he had helped normalize. One evening, he asked me outright if I thought the company was in trouble. I looked at him carefully before answering. That depends, I said, on whether the people making decisions actually know what they're doing. He frowned, uneasy, but said nothing. At the next family gathering, the tension was thick enough to taste. Conversations felt rehearsed. Laughter came a second too late. My father-in-law avoided my eyes completely, while my mother-in-law studied me with a sharpness she hadn't used before. I realized then that they were starting to suspect me, not as a threat, but as an unknown variable. And in business, uncertainty is terrifying. They had always believed power meant controlling access. What they were learning was that power actually comes from controlling outcomes. Over the next few weeks, I accelerated what I had already set in motion. I didn't withdraw everything at once. That would have been obvious, and obvious moves invite resistance. Instead, I introduced conditions. Performance reviews. Compliance checks. Market-aligned adjustments. All standard, all justified. Each one shaved a little more stability from their foundation. I wasn't attacking them. I was letting them experience the consequences of decisions made without me. Internally, they turned on each other. I heard whispers about disagreements over expansion, accusations about who had approved what. My name came up more often, always followed by silence. The unspoken question hovered over every discussion: should she have been included? Still, pride held them back. Pride always lasts longer than wisdom. My husband finally broke when a major partnership collapsed unexpectedly. He came home shaken, admitting they hadn't anticipated the fallout. We didn't see it coming, he said, rubbing his temples. I met his eyes. You can't see what you refuse to look at, I replied. That was the first time he asked me to help. Not directly. Not humbly. Just a casual suggestion that I might have insight worth sharing. I told him I'd consider it. Consideration became my leverage. Behind the scenes, I was already preparing the final phase. I began conversations with competitors, quiet, respectful, exploratory. I didn't betray anyone. I simply evaluated alternatives. And the alternatives welcomed me with open arms. They saw what my in-laws never did, not just capital, but competence. They offered me influence, transparency, a seat at the table without conditions. For the first time since I married into that family, I felt something close to validation. Meanwhile, my in-laws grew desperate. They invited me to a meeting at last, framing it as reconciliation. When I walked into that boardroom, I felt their eyes on me, not with dismissal, but with fear. They spoke carefully, choosing words that sounded inclusive without admitting fault. I let them talk. Then I asked a single question that froze the room: why now? No one answered. They couldn't. Because admitting the truth would have meant admitting they were wrong. That meeting changed everything. Not because I agreed to help, but because I didn't need to. I had already outgrown the space they denied me. The balance of power had shifted completely, and they were just beginning to understand that banning me had never protected them. It had exposed them. After that meeting, nothing went back to normal, not that normal ever truly existed. The illusion just finally cracked wide open. I could feel it in the way my phone started ringing more often, always with their numbers, always at inconvenient times. I let most of the calls go unanswered. Silence is a language people only understand when they're desperate. My husband began walking on emotional glass around me, careful with his words, hesitant with his assumptions. He sensed that the ground beneath him was shifting, that the version of me he thought he knew, the accommodating wife, the patient outsider, had disappeared. And he was right. That version of me had been built on hope. This one was built on clarity. At the company, the consequences of their choices were stacking faster than they could manage. Vendors tightened credit. Staff turnover increased as uncertainty spread. The leadership meetings I was still excluded from turned into echo chambers where the same people repeated the same ideas, convinced volume could replace insight. I knew because the aftershocks reached me anyway, through financial reports, industry chatter, and the subtle panic that seeps into every corner when a business starts to wobble. My mother-in-law finally stopped pretending. She invited me to lunch, just the two of us. No smiles. No small talk. Straight to the point. She said they needed me, that the company had always valued my contributions, that maybe mistakes had been made in how I was integrated. Integrated. As if I were a system update they forgot to install. I listened patiently, then asked her if she would have invited me if the numbers hadn't turned against them. Her silence answered for her. I declined her offer to return things to the way they were. Not out of spite, but because the way they were was the problem. That refusal triggered the unraveling. My husband was caught in the middle, torn between loyalty to the family that raised him and the woman he married but never fully defended. The strain showed. Arguments became frequent, unresolved, heavy with things we had avoided saying for years. He accused me of punishing them. I told him I was simply refusing to save people who never respected me. The truth landed hard between us. Around the same time, one of the competitors I'd been speaking with made a formal proposal. It wasn't just lucrative, it was validating. They wanted me not just as a client, but as a strategic partner. Transparency. Authority. Mutual respect. Everything I had been denied. Accepting it would mean cutting the last thread tying me to my in-laws' empire. I didn't decide immediately. I wanted to see how far they would go without me. They went further than I expected. When another key account followed my lead and renegotiated, panic turned into blame. Meetings became hostile. Long-standing relationships fractured. And then they made their final mistake. They tried to pressure me, subtly at first, then openly. Legal threats disguised as concerns. Emotional appeals framed as family duty. My husband was used as a messenger more than once, something I didn't forgive easily. That was the moment I chose myself. I signed the new partnership agreement quietly, without drama. The effect was immediate. The company lost stability, credibility, and leverage all at once. What they had dismissed as a single excluded voice turned out to be the keystone holding everything together. The fallout wasn't explosive. It was worse. It was slow, public, undeniable. And through it all, I stayed calm. Because revenge isn't loud when it's inevitable. The collapse didn't announce itself with headlines or dramatic exits. It arrived the way real consequences always do, quietly at first, then all at once. The first sign was denial. My in-laws insisted the company was restructuring, that temporary setbacks were part of growth. But restructuring doesn't feel like fear, and fear had become the dominant currency in their offices. Employees whispered. Partners hesitated. The market noticed. When confidence evaporates, it leaves fingerprints everywhere. My husband watched it happen from the inside, torn between defending decisions he no longer believed in and confronting a truth he wasn't ready to face. The family he trusted had built its success on exclusion, not excellence. At home, the distance between us grew heavy and unavoidable. He wanted me to step in, to rescue them, to prove that family meant unconditional support. I wanted him to understand that family also meant accountability. One night, after another circular argument, I asked him a question that ended the conversation. If I weren't your wife, I said, would they have ever listened to me? He didn't answer. That silence told me more than any apology could. The company's decline accelerated when regulators began asking questions I had warned about months earlier and been dismissed for raising. Compliance gaps surfaced. Documentation was missing. Processes that had worked on trust rather than structure started collapsing under scrutiny. Every issue traced back to the same flaw, decisions made in closed rooms by people who believed status protected them from consequences. I was no longer involved, but my shadow loomed over every failure. They couldn't admit it publicly, but privately my name was spoken like a regret. Offers to bring me back became more desperate, less dignified. They promised roles, influence, even partial ownership. All too late. I had already learned the cost of belonging to a table that never wanted me there. Meanwhile, my new partnership flourished. The contrast was striking. Meetings were open. Debate was encouraged. My insights were not just heard, they were sought. I found myself thriving in an environment built on merit instead of hierarchy. For the first time, I wasn't proving my worth. I was exercising it. That growth forced a reckoning in my marriage. My husband struggled to reconcile the woman I had become with the one he had underestimated. Resentment and admiration tangled into something unsustainable. When he finally asked if I still believed in us, I told him the truth. Belief requires safety, and I hadn't felt safe standing beside him when it mattered most. We separated quietly, without spectacle. There was no villain speech, no dramatic betrayal. Just the heavy understanding that some bonds break not from hatred, but from repeated neglect. As for my in-laws, their empire didn't vanish overnight. It eroded. Contracts lost. Influence faded. The name that once commanded respect became a cautionary tale whispered in industry circles. They never apologized. People rarely do when pride is all they have left. But they didn't need to. The outcome spoke louder than any confession. They banned me from meetings thinking they were protecting their power. In reality, they were isolating themselves from the very perspective that could have saved them. And in doing so, they taught me the most valuable lesson of all: exclusion doesn't weaken you when you know your value. It reveals exactly where you should never return. Time has a way of turning consequences into clarity. Months after I walked away, the noise finally settled, leaving behind something far more uncomfortable for everyone involved: truth. Without distractions, without blame to hide behind, the patterns became impossible to ignore. The company was still operating, but it was a shell of what it once was. Where ambition had lived, there was now caution. Where certainty once ruled, hesitation took its place. The family meetings I had been banned from continued, but they no longer carried authority. Decisions were reactive, not strategic. Every move felt like a response to loss rather than a pursuit of growth. From the outside, I watched without bitterness. I had processed my anger already. What remained was understanding. I understood how easily people confuse control with leadership, how exclusion becomes a habit justified by tradition, and how quickly power dissolves when it's built on fear instead of respect. My husband tried, in his own quiet way, to reconnect. Not to fix what was broken, but to understand it. We spoke honestly for the first time in years. He admitted he had benefited from the system that silenced me, even if he hadn't designed it. He apologized, not defensively, not conditionally, but with the weight of recognition. It didn't change our outcome, but it softened the ending. Closure doesn't always mean reconciliation. Sometimes it simply means being seen at last. Professionally, my life expanded in ways I hadn't imagined while shrinking myself to fit someone else's comfort. I traveled. I spoke. I advised. People sought my perspective not because of who I was married to, but because of what I knew. Each success reinforced the same truth: my exclusion had never been about my limitations. It had been about theirs. The last time I saw my mother-in-law, she looked smaller, not physically, but in presence. She congratulated me on my achievements with a tight smile that carried both pride and regret. I thanked her sincerely. Without her choices, I might never have found my way out. As I walked away, I realized the revenge I had imagined at the beginning, public humiliation, dramatic confrontation, would have been empty. What I had done instead was far more lasting. I had reclaimed my voice, redirected my power, and refused to rescue people who only valued me when they were failing. In the end, the ban that was meant to silence me became the door that freed me. And the family business that once defined my place in their world became nothing more than a chapter in the story of how I learned my worth. After the dust settled, something unexpected happened. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was spacious. For the first time in years, my decisions didn't require approval, justification, or careful emotional management. I woke up without bracing myself for subtle dismissals or strategic avoidance. That freedom felt unfamiliar at first, almost unsettling. When you've spent so long being underestimated, peace can feel suspicious. But slowly, I learned to trust it. My work began to take on a different quality. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was creating. I invested in ventures that aligned with my values, not just profitability. I mentored people who reminded me of who I used to be: capable, observant, quietly powerful, and waiting for permission they didn't need. Every conversation reinforced the same lesson: talent doesn't need validation to exist. It only needs opportunity. The industry noticed the shift. Invitations came in not because of spectacle, but because of consistency. People remembered how I had exited a failing structure without drama and built something stronger elsewhere. Reputation, I learned, is forged not in what you say, but in what you survive without becoming bitter. Meanwhile, my former in-laws struggled to adapt to a world that no longer bent around them. Their names still opened some doors, but fewer stayed open. Legacy can't compensate for relevance forever. Younger competitors moved faster. Smarter systems replaced outdated authority. They weren't villains. They were simply people who believed too long that tradition was protection. One afternoon, I received a message I hadn't expected. A junior executive from their company asked if we could talk. Not to negotiate, not to plead, but to learn. She told me my story had circulated quietly among employees, not as gossip, but as a warning. They didn't listen, she said, and we all paid for it. That was the moment I understood the full reach of what had happened. This wasn't just personal revenge. It was a lesson etched into the culture they once controlled. At night, when I reflected on everything that had unfolded, I felt no urge to go back and change it. Even the pain had shaped me with precision. Being banned from those meetings had forced me to confront a truth I might have avoided forever: belonging that requires silence is not belonging at all. I had mistaken access for acceptance, proximity for power. Losing both gave me clarity. The final irony revealed itself months later when I was invited to speak at an industry forum about leadership, inclusion, and strategic blind spots. Representatives from my former in-laws network were in the audience. I didn't acknowledge them directly. I didn't need to. Every word I spoke was a mirror. When the applause came, it wasn't loud. It was sustained. Respect doesn't erupt. It settles. And as I stepped off that stage, I realized something profound. They had banned me to diminish my influence. Instead, they had refined it. They thought exclusion would keep me small. It taught me scale. This wasn't the ending I had once imagined, but it was better. Because my response didn't just leave them weakened. It left me unbreakable. The more distance I gained from that chapter of my life, the clearer its shape became. What once felt like chaos revealed itself as sequence, cause and effect unfolding with quiet precision. I began to understand that revenge, in its truest form, isn't about destruction. It's about transcendence. About becoming so rooted in your own worth that the people who tried to erase you are forced to confront your absence more than your presence. I stopped monitoring their decline after a while. Not out of indifference, but because it no longer mattered. My life was full in ways that had nothing to do with proving a point. Yet echoes of the past continued to reach me, uninvited but informative. Former partners reached out, cautiously, seeking insight. Employees left that company and found success elsewhere, often crediting the shift in culture they'd witnessed during the fallout. Even my ex-husband changed. He no longer defended what had happened. He acknowledged it openly, publicly, in conversations where my name was mentioned with respect instead of discomfort. That mattered more than apologies ever could. One evening, long after the dust had settled, I revisited the memory that started it all, the day I was told I didn't belong in the room where decisions were made. I remembered how small that moment had made me feel, how I questioned myself instead of questioning the system. That reflection didn't hurt anymore. It grounded me. It reminded me that growth rarely announces itself as opportunity. Sometimes it arrives disguised as rejection. I began telling my story selectively, not as a warning, but as an invitation. An invitation for others, especially women, especially outsiders, to recognize when they are being tolerated instead of trusted. To understand that waiting for inclusion from people invested in your silence is a losing strategy. The response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from people who had lived parallel versions of my experience, who had mistaken endurance for loyalty. They saw themselves in my restraint, my patience, my eventual refusal to stay small. And that, more than anything, confirmed that what I had done mattered beyond me. The final closure came quietly, on an ordinary day. I received notice that the company had been acquired, absorbed into a larger entity that dismantled its family hierarchy within months. The name that once defined power became a footnote. There was no satisfaction in that news. Only resolution. Systems that resist accountability eventually surrender to it. That's not revenge. That's inevitability. As I stood in my own office later that evening, surrounded by a team that respected me, by work that challenged me, I realized the greatest irony of all. They had tried to protect their legacy by excluding me. In doing so, they ensured I would build one of my own. And that legacy, earned, not inherited, would never need closed doors to survive. Even after what should have been the ending, life kept offering me small reminders of how deeply that chapter had reshaped me. Growth doesn't stop just because the conflict is resolved. It echoes. It tests whether the lessons were learned or merely survived. In the months following the acquisition, I was invited into rooms that once would have intimidated me. Boardrooms. Private strategy sessions. Conversations where the stakes were high and the margins for error unforgiving. What surprised me wasn't the pressure, it was how natural it felt. I didn't shrink. I didn't over-explain. I spoke when I had something to say and stayed silent when I didn't. That confidence wasn't something I had practiced. It had been forged in exclusion. I had learned how to think independently because I'd been forced to. I had learned how to evaluate risk without consensus because I'd been denied it. In a strange way, being banned from those family meetings had trained me for something bigger than they could ever offer. Occasionally, someone new would ask about my background, about the company I was once connected to. I answered honestly but briefly. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't frame myself as a victim. I framed it as experience. People respect that. They trust it. There's a quiet authority in not needing sympathy. One afternoon, I received a message from someone I never expected to hear from again, my former father-in-law. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a request. It was a simple acknowledgement. He wrote that he had underestimated me, that he now understood the cost of that mistake, and that he hoped I was doing well. I read the message twice, then closed it without replying. Not out of anger, but because some acknowledgements don't require response to be complete. They exist to give closure to the person sending them, not the one receiving them. I had already moved on. What mattered more to me were the moments that followed, watching young professionals step into leadership with confidence because they'd seen what exclusion could do. Hearing someone say, "I asked for a seat at the table because of your story." That was impact. That was legacy. I realized then that revenge stories are often misunderstood. They're not about watching someone fall. They're about refusing to fall with them. They're about redirecting pain into precision, rejection into refinement. The people who tried to silence me never became villains in my story. They became catalysts. And catalysts don't get credit for the reactions they start. They just disappear once their role is complete. As I closed that chapter for good, I understood something that would have changed everything if I had known it earlier. You don't need permission to belong where your value is obvious. And anyone who makes you earn dignity by shrinking is never building something meant to last. I wasn't banned from those meetings because I didn't deserve to be there. I was banned because my presence would have forced them to evolve. And evolution is terrifying to people who confuse power with permanence. My response didn't destroy them. It simply removed me from the equation they depended on. And without me, the truth surfaced on its own. With time, distance sharpened my perspective even further. I began to notice how often people mistake proximity to power for power itself. I had lived that illusion for years, believing that being near the decision-makers meant I was protected, valued, included. The truth was harsher and simpler. Proximity without authority is just visibility without voice. And visibility without voice makes you a target, not a partner. That realization changed how I moved through every professional space afterward. I stopped accepting vague roles, undefined influence, or "we'll loop you in later" promises. I asked direct questions. I requested clarity. And when clarity wasn't offered, I walked away without apology. The confidence to leave is something only exclusion can teach you. I crossed paths with my ex-husband at an industry event months later. There was no bitterness between us anymore, just an unmistakable distance shaped by growth in opposite directions. He congratulated me on my work, openly, without hesitation. I thanked him and meant it. In his eyes, I saw something that hadn't been there before, respect untainted by entitlement. Sometimes people only learn your worth after losing access to it. That's not justice. That's consequence. As I continued building, I encountered resistance of a different kind. Not dismissal, but challenge. People questioned my ideas not because I didn't belong, but because they mattered. Debate replaced doubt. That shift felt earned. I welcomed it. Being taken seriously is a responsibility as much as it is a privilege. One evening, while reviewing proposals late into the night, I paused and thought about the version of myself who had once waited outside closed doors, convincing herself that patience was loyalty. I wished I could speak to her, tell her that loyalty without reciprocity is self-erasure, that endurance isn't noble when it costs you your voice. But maybe she needed to learn it the hard way. Maybe I did too. The story I lived didn't end with a ruined company or broken relationships. It ended with alignment. My values matched my environment. My voice matched my influence. My life matched my potential. That alignment is rare, and it's never handed to you. It's built, often out of rejection, often in silence, often long before anyone notices. When people ask me now what the turning point was, I don't mention contracts or meetings or money. I tell them the truth. The turning point was the moment I stopped asking to be included and started deciding where I belonged. Everything else followed naturally. The longer I lived in that alignment, the more I understood how fragile false power really is. I saw it in boardrooms where titles spoke louder than ideas, in leaders who guarded authority instead of earning trust. Once you've been excluded for no valid reason, you develop an instinct for recognizing hollow structures. You can feel when a system is built to protect egos rather than outcomes. And you learn, quickly, not to tie your future to it. I became intentional about where I invested my energy. I said no more than I said yes. I chose collaborators who valued dissent, who welcomed challenge, who understood that growth requires discomfort. Ironically, these were the very qualities my former in-laws had feared. The things they tried to suppress were the things that made me effective elsewhere. Sometimes I wondered what would have happened if they had listened early on. If they had invited me in, treated me as an equal, trusted my perspective. But that curiosity never turned into regret. Because the version of me that emerged from exclusion was sharper, braver, and far more self-directed than the one they would have shaped. At a leadership retreat, someone once asked me how I handled being underestimated without becoming resentful. I answered honestly, resentment thrives when you stay where you're not respected. It dissolves the moment you leave. I didn't heal by winning. I healed by walking away and building something better. Late one night, I reviewed an old email thread, the one that had formally excluded me from those early meetings. I didn't feel anger reading it. I felt gratitude. That message was the beginning of everything that followed. It forced me to see the reality I had been avoiding. It forced me to stop negotiating my worth. And it forced them to face a future without me. That, I realized, was the cleanest revenge of all. Not collapse. Not confrontation. Absence. When you remove yourself from a structure that relies on your silence, it doesn't just lose you. It loses its illusion of control. And once that illusion breaks, everything built on it eventually follows. Months turned into years, and the consequences of exclusion rippled farther than anyone could have anticipated. Former colleagues who had witnessed my exclusion began seeking mentorship, inspired by the quiet power I had cultivated. They didn't want to replicate my story, they wanted to understand how to survive, grow, and thrive in spaces that undervalue them. I became a guide without intending to, simply by demonstrating that survival isn't enough, strategic transformation is the key. My former in-law's company continued to limp along. Meetings were still held, contracts still signed, but each decision carried the invisible weight of what had been lost by ignoring a critical voice. Their influence shrank not because I sought to diminish it, but because exclusion carries hidden costs that compound over time. One evening, my husband reached out, not to apologize, not to negotiate, simply to ask for perspective. He asked how I had navigated the fallout so calmly, so deliberately. I explained that power is temporary if unearned and that survival without influence is empty. He listened quietly, and for the first time, I saw the respect that had been absent for years. Not admiration born of pride, but acknowledgement of competence and foresight. That acknowledgement didn't change the past. It didn't alter decisions already made or opportunities lost. But it did mark a boundary, recognition of my autonomy. I began documenting my strategies, how I had managed leverage without confrontation, how patience and observation became tools sharper than anger or revenge. Those notes became frameworks for others in similar positions, people who had been excluded, dismissed, or underestimated. I realized then that the impact of exclusion extends beyond personal growth. It has the power to shape systems, influence cultures, and redefine standards of authority. By the time I was asked to speak at a major industry conference, the irony was palpable. The audience included some of the very people who had once dismissed me, along with countless others who had learned of my story through whispers, articles, and informal networks. I didn't gloat. I didn't dramatize. I spoke about insight, patience, and the subtle architecture of influence. Every nod, every note, every question reflected the credibility I had earned, not from their permission, but from my own deliberate cultivation. And in that moment, I understood the ultimate form of vindication, not destruction, not humiliation, not spectacle, but a life rebuilt with intention, respect, and undeniable authority. The people who had banned me from meetings had tried to silence me. Instead, they had refined me, sharpened my perspective, and prepared me for influence they could never offer. And that, I realized, is the truest revenge imaginable, rising above the limitations imposed on you until your absence is more powerful than any presence they once ignored. Even after I had claimed my independence, the echoes of the past continued to shape my perspective. Every business meeting, every strategic decision, carried the imprint of what I had endured. I no longer measured success by money alone, or by recognition granted by others. I measured it by clarity, influence, and the freedom to act without compromise. The most striking realization came unexpectedly. I noticed how often people around me deferred not to authority, but to insight. They trusted judgment rooted in observation and experience rather than inherited privilege. That shift was subtle but transformative. I remembered the early days, when my in-laws assumed that silence meant obedience and absence meant compliance. How little they understood that restraint, when guided by foresight, becomes a weapon. Quiet observation is not weakness, it is preparation. My husband began to evolve as well, though differently. He respected my decisions now, but he no longer sought to align me with his family's expectations. That separation of roles created a new kind of partnership, one based on understanding and autonomy rather than entitlement and control. Occasionally, my former in-laws attempted subtle manipulations, suggesting that I might reconsider, hinting at the value they once believed they held over me. I ignored them. The power they hoped to leverage existed only in my willingness to grant it. Without that, their influence dissolved naturally. Professionally, my ventures expanded beyond what I had ever imagined while trapped in their shadow. Mentorship programs, strategic investments, advisory roles, all became arenas in which my decisions shaped outcomes more significantly than any single meeting ever could. The ultimate irony became evident. The very exclusion that had been intended to minimize my influence had created a skill set and reputation far stronger than any they could control. Reflection became a habit. I often considered what it would have taken for the family to include me willingly rather than exclude me forcefully. The answer was simple: respect, transparency, acknowledgement of competence. Everything else had been a facade. But by the time that clarity arrived, it was irrelevant. I had already carved a path that no closed door could block. The final lesson was clear: people who ban others from spaces of influence reveal not only weakness in their systems but also the potential for greatness in those they exclude. And when the excluded person recognizes their own value, the consequences for those who underestimated them are inevitable, whether they anticipate them or not. Why this point? My former in-law's company had become a cautionary tale in quiet industry circles. People spoke of mismanagement, of overconfidence, and of exclusion that backfired spectacularly. Yet, none of this was public spectacle. It unfolded in boardrooms, in client hesitations, in revenue projections that never matched expectations. Their legacy was intact in name only. Influence had slipped through their fingers because they had refused to see the one person whose insight could have preserved it. I received occasional updates through mutual contacts, news of lost accounts, leadership disputes, small but telling failures. And I felt nothing but clarity. No schadenfreude, no lingering resentment, just the knowledge that systems built on exclusion are inherently fragile. Meanwhile, my own ventures continued to grow, each one reflecting lessons learned the hard way. I became increasingly selective about partnerships, wary of organizations that equated silence with loyalty. I surrounded myself with people who challenged me, encouraged dialogue, and celebrated diverse perspectives. This ecosystem of respect and accountability was far more powerful than any inherited authority my in-laws had relied upon. My husband and I maintained a tentative civility. He was no longer caught between allegiance and insight. He had seen what exclusion cost firsthand. And though we had parted ways in terms of personal life, he became a witness to the professional autonomy I had cultivated, perhaps understanding too late the consequences of undervaluing me. One afternoon, a young entrepreneur approached me at a seminar, wide-eyed, asking how I had managed to transform adversity into such sustainable influence. I paused, then told her exactly what I had learned: exclusion teaches clarity. Silence teaches observation. Denial teaches patience. Every barrier is a lesson disguised as punishment, if you choose to see it that way. She listened intently, scribbling notes. I realized then that the impact of my journey extended beyond personal vindication. It became a blueprint for anyone who had ever been underestimated, dismissed, or silenced. That, I decided, was the most enduring revenge of all, not watching someone falter, but rising so completely that your absence becomes a force impossible to ignore. My in-laws had tried to ban me from meetings, to minimize my voice, to keep me small. And yet, decades later, my influence, my insight, and my leadership had outlasted their structure entirely. In the quiet aftermath, I understood the full scope of what had happened. True power is not given. It is cultivated, earned, and exercised with intention, and exclusion, ironically, often provides the perfect conditions for it to flourish. Years passed, and with each passing year, the magnitude of what had unfolded became clearer, not just to me, but to those who had witnessed the ripple effects. My former in-laws' business struggled to stay relevant. The leadership vacuum left by their repeated exclusion of critical voices widened into a chasm. Deals that once seemed secure slipped through their fingers. Strategies that relied on assumption rather than insight failed, and their reputation as infallible leaders slowly eroded. Meanwhile, I thrived. I expanded my influence into industries they had dismissed as outside their scope. I consulted for startups, advised executives, and built teams that valued contribution over hierarchy. The growth wasn't just professional, it was personal. I no longer questioned my worth or hesitated to speak. My confidence was quiet, firm, and unshakable. One day, I was approached by a former executive from their company. He had left quietly, frustrated by the culture of exclusion. "You were right all along," he admitted. "Everything you warned about, it happened." I simply nodded. There was no satisfaction in confrontation, no need to highlight my foresight. The truth existed in their daily struggles and my steady progress. My ex-husband occasionally reached out for advice, not as a spouse, but as someone seeking insight into a system he no longer controlled. Our conversations were civil, professional, and strangely affirming. He had learned that being part of a system doesn't equal power, and that loyalty without recognition is hollow. As I reflected on the journey, I realized the full extent of my transformation. I hadn't just reclaimed my voice, I had built an ecosystem where my decisions, expertise, and perspective carried weight, without the need to fight for acknowledgement. The ultimate irony settled in my mind: the very exclusion that was meant to diminish me had, in fact, refined me. It forced me to observe, to strategize, to anticipate consequences, and to act with precision. I had been banned from meetings to limit my influence, and yet my influence had grown far beyond the walls they had tried to control. By this stage, my story had become more than personal vindication. It had become a lesson in resilience, strategy, and self-worth. People began seeking my advice not because of titles, but because they recognized insight when they saw it. I taught them to recognize subtle power, to act decisively, and to trust their judgment even when the world attempts to silence them. The final understanding was profound: true revenge is never in watching someone fall. True revenge is in rising completely, without apology, without spectacle, and without allowing the limitations others imposed on you to define your trajectory. By now, the concept of exclusion had transformed from a source of pain into a framework for strategy. I began mentoring young professionals, particularly women, about the subtle dynamics of being underestimated and ignored. I told them the truth I had learned the hard way: being silent in the face of dismissal doesn't make you patient, it makes you invisible. They listened, eyes wide, understanding that what I was describing wasn't theory, it was lived experience. At the same time, I maintained a distance from my former in-laws' company. I no longer checked on its struggles, no longer engaged with gossip, no longer allowed their failures to define my emotional landscape. Observing from afar, I could see the patterns repeating: attempts to control, moments of denial, the slow unraveling of influence that had once seemed unassailable. It reinforced one principle I had come to value above all: influence must be earned through respect and insight, not demanded through fear or exclusion. My husband and I maintained a professional civility, though our personal relationship had long since shifted. He had learned, painfully, that partnership requires recognition, not just proximity. Our conversations now focused on analysis, strategy, and outcomes rather than entitlement or family politics. In this new dynamic, I realized something else: the most powerful leverage in life isn't money, connections, or titles. It's clarity. Knowing your value, understanding the systems around you, and acting deliberately without needing approval. That clarity allowed me to navigate opportunities with confidence, to decline invitations that would dilute my focus, and to embrace roles that expanded my reach rather than just my resume. Occasionally, I reflected on what might have happened if my in-laws had included me instead of excluding me. Their fear of exposure had dictated their decisions, but it had inadvertently prepared me for influence I could never have gained within their limited framework. In their efforts to suppress me, they had sharpened my instincts, expanded my autonomy, and cultivated an authority that would be impossible to diminish. The most telling moments came when others sought guidance. They asked how I had transformed adversity into opportunity. I told them plainly: the key is observation, patience, and decisive action. The world will attempt to ban you from tables that matter. It's not the table that gives power, it's what you do with the knowledge you gain while you're waiting for a seat. My former in-laws had tried to shape my story without my consent. In doing so, they created the conditions for me to write it on my own terms. And when the final chapter began to unfold, I realized the ultimate truth: true power doesn't shout. It persists quietly, inevitably, and with the inevitability of a force that cannot be ignored. The years that followed were marked less by drama and more by precision. Every decision I made, every partnership I nurtured, carried the weight of the lessons learned from exclusion. I no longer rushed to prove myself to anyone. The proof existed in the outcomes I created and the influence I wielded naturally. The industry began to take notice, not as a spectacle, but as a pattern. My name appeared on panels, in articles, in invitations that recognized expertise rather than inherited privilege. And each time, I reminded myself of the irony. The very exclusion that had been meant to minimize me had amplified my visibility in spaces that truly mattered. My former in-laws, by contrast, remained trapped in their own framework. Their attempts to regain control were haphazard, reactive, and transparent. They failed not because I sabotaged them, but because their structure had been built on hierarchy and exclusion rather than competence and insight. Observing their efforts from a distance reinforced a critical truth: systems collapse when they refuse to adapt to reality. People may hold titles, but without understanding, authority is hollow. Occasionally, my husband would ask questions, seeking my perspective not as a spouse, but as someone attempting to understand why influence mattered more than proximity. Those conversations became opportunities to articulate the strategies I had developed, to reflect on patience, observation, and decisive action. I never approached them as lessons for him alone. They were lessons for anyone willing to listen, for anyone who had been silenced or underestimated. One day, at a mentorship seminar, a young professional asked what the pivotal moment had been, the day that truly set the course for my transformation. I paused, reflecting on the countless small moments that had built the foundation for everything that followed. And then I said, it wasn't a single moment. It was the accumulation of being denied, dismissed, and underestimated. It was learning to turn every exclusion into clarity, every silence into strategy, every obstacle into leverage. That's when true power is born. Applause followed, but it was the quiet nods, the thoughtful expressions, that mattered most. Those were the signs that the lesson had landed, that exclusion, while painful, had created the conditions for growth and influence far greater than anything acceptance could have offered. My former in-laws' attempts to maintain authority had ultimately done the opposite. By trying to control, exclude, and minimize, they revealed the very qualities that made me indispensable. And when I finally embraced that understanding fully, I realized that my response, the patient, deliberate cultivation of skill, reputation, and autonomy, was the revenge that would last a lifetime. As time passed, I began to notice subtle changes in the way the industry responded to my presence. Invitations arrived with genuine intent rather than obligation. Ideas I proposed were implemented, not debated unnecessarily. People deferred to insight rather than title. Every interaction became a quiet affirmation of the truth I had discovered years before: influence is cultivated, not inherited. Respect is earned, not demanded. My former in-laws continued to occupy the same offices, conduct the same meetings, and rely on the same strategies. Yet, their influence waned incrementally. Deals fell through. Promising partnerships stalled. Employees questioned decisions more openly, no longer intimidated by a hierarchy built on exclusion rather than merit. And though I was no longer directly involved, the contrast was clear: inclusion paired with competence breeds stability, while exclusion paired with arrogance breeds fragility. I reflected often on my personal journey. From the moment I was barred from meetings, I had been forced to develop a skill set that no formal education could have provided. Observation, patience, strategic calculation, all honed in the crucible of exclusion. I realized that my former in-laws' attempts to suppress my voice had inadvertently shaped me into a leader who could thrive in any environment, even those far larger and more complex than the company I had once been denied access to. My husband's own transformation was slower, but visible. He began to understand that proximity to authority without insight is a dangerous illusion. He witnessed the consequences of dismissing someone whose influence cannot be contained by seating arrangements or hierarchical titles. Our relationship evolved into one defined by mutual recognition rather than dependence, respect rather than expectation. Occasionally, opportunities arose for me to intervene directly in the family business, not out of revenge, but out of principle. I declined every time. Intervention would have been a compromise, a return to a space that had never truly valued me. Instead, I allowed their systems to collapse naturally, letting the consequences of their choices speak louder than any confrontation ever could. The most profound realization came when I considered my own journey. The barriers imposed on me were never permanent obstacles. They were catalysts. Each denial, each exclusion, each subtle act of dismissal was an invitation to grow, to refine strategy, to cultivate influence. And when I finally embraced that truth fully, I understood the ultimate form of revenge, not destruction, not humiliation, but rising beyond the confines of those who tried to suppress you, leaving their world altered by your absence and your presence simultaneously. With each passing year, the scope of my own ventures expanded, and with it, my understanding of influence deepened. I realized that the most enduring power isn't the authority granted by others, it's the credibility you cultivate, the foresight you develop, and the decisions you execute with precision. Exclusion had taught me all three. My former in-laws, in contrast, clung to outdated practices and the illusion of control. Every attempt to regain their former standing only highlighted the fragility of their methods. The company's decline was gradual but unmistakable. Deals that once seemed secure faltered. Key employees quietly departed, unwilling to remain in a culture that punished insight. Stakeholders questioned decisions that had once been unquestionable. And yet, none of this was my doing. I observed, I noted, I learned. Their missteps became lessons for my own enterprise. I refined processes, implemented systems of accountability, and built a team where dissent was encouraged and insight rewarded. My reputation flourished, not through spectacle, but through consistent, deliberate results. Occasionally, I reflected on my past with my husband. He had grown, too, though his path remained more hesitant. He admitted, quietly, that he had underestimated the consequences of exclusion, that he hadn't realized how much influence can exist outside formal authority. Our conversations, once fraught with tension, became exchanges of strategy, perspective, and analysis. There was no reconciliation in the emotional sense, there was, instead, a mutual acknowledgement of growth. The ultimate irony revealed itself in the next generation of leaders I mentored. Many of them had experienced similar forms of exclusion in their own careers. They listened intently as I shared the strategies I had developed, not to instruct, but to empower. They began to see the patterns, recognize the subtle power dynamics, and understand that the absence of authority does not equate to absence of influence. And the most important lesson they absorbed, exclusion, when navigated with clarity, patience, and strategy, can become the catalyst for extraordinary achievement. My former in-laws never acknowledged this explicitly. Their pride prevented them from admitting any error. But the consequences spoke for themselves. Their business, once seemingly untouchable, was diminished. Their influence faded. And I, once barred from their meetings, had constructed a network, a legacy, and a career that flourished precisely because they had attempted to silence me. The truest form of victory, I realized, is quiet, deliberate, and enduring, to rise fully, to build independently, and to leave the people who underestimated you to witness, powerless, the fruits of the opportunities they denied you. By now, the lessons from my past had fully integrated into the way I led, mentored, and made decisions. Exclusion was no longer a wound, it was a compass. It taught me to discern between environments that would nurture my growth and those designed to limit it. I realized that the most significant power comes not from occupying a seat at the table, but from shaping the outcome without being invited. Opportunities began to arrive naturally, not because I sought them, but because my reputation had become a force in itself. I noticed patterns in other companies, in industries, in leaders who relied on inherited authority rather than cultivated insight. I saw how frequently exclusion of critical voices led to mismanagement, poor decisions, and eventual instability. And I understood my own story within that context. I had been denied, dismissed, and underestimated, not as an accident, but as a reflection of their fear of disruption. Each interaction I had with colleagues, partners, and mentors became an opportunity to share this understanding, to instill awareness of the subtle dynamics that shape success. I emphasized observation, patience, and strategic action. I demonstrated that silence, when used intentionally, could yield greater influence than confrontation ever could. My former in-laws' decline continued in parallel, though I no longer paid close attention. Their struggles were self-inflicted, the result of their refusal to adapt, to listen, and to recognize talent when it appeared. Occasionally, I would hear of missteps, failed partnerships, internal conflicts, stagnating growth, but these reports were merely confirmations of the lessons I had internalized. Exclusion eventually carries a cost. The ultimate revelation came when I was asked to advise an emerging company facing internal discord. Their leadership had sidelined several critical voices, and the consequences were beginning to show. I guided them through observing the patterns, valuing insight, and implementing structural changes that ensured inclusion without compromise. As I left the meeting, I reflected on the irony. I had been excluded from one room decades ago, yet now, I was shaping cultures and guiding companies precisely because I had learned to act without permission. The truest revenge, I understood, is not in spectacle or humiliation. It is in rising beyond the limitations others impose, in cultivating authority that cannot be revoked, and in leaving a legacy defined not by the people who tried to diminish you, but by the influence you wield independent of them. Exclusion had been the spark. Mastery had been the flame. And in that light, I realized, the person who bans you from the table never wins. They only prepare you to create your own. By the time I reached this point in my journey, the scope of my influence had grown far beyond anything I could have imagined while sitting outside those family meetings, silenced and overlooked. The very exclusion intended to diminish me had instead refined my instincts, sharpened my judgment, and expanded my autonomy. Every choice I made carried weight because it was deliberate, informed, and free from the compromises forced upon me in the past. I began hosting workshops and talks, sharing strategies for navigating professional spaces where voices are often dismissed. Participants listened closely, recognizing the subtleties I described, the silent hierarchies, the informal power brokers, the ways influence can be exercised without official titles. They absorbed not just the tactics, but the mindset, patience, observation, and precision. My former in-laws remained tethered to their old ways. Attempts to innovate or regain control were clumsy, reactive, and transparent. Without the input they had once refused, the company faltered. Deals slipped. Confidence eroded. And still, I did not intervene. There was no need. The consequences of exclusion are inevitable, and they were now playing out exactly as predicted. Occasionally, my ex-husband reached out, not for reconciliation, not for approval, but for perspective. He wanted to understand how I had navigated exclusion without resentment, without compromise, and without sacrificing opportunity. Our conversations were calm, analytical, and affirming. They confirmed a truth I had long recognized: autonomy, once claimed, cannot be undermined by the people who tried to suppress it. Even more profoundly, I realized the ripple effect of my response. It had inspired others to recognize their own potential, to challenge outdated hierarchies, and to exercise influence in spaces where they had once been silenced. That, more than any personal triumph, felt like the ultimate vindication. Exclusion had not destroyed me, it had provided the conditions to build authority, reputation, and influence that could not be revoked. I had risen, quietly, deliberately, and fully, leaving behind a world that had tried to minimize me and entering one I had shaped entirely on my own terms. And in that realization, I found the deepest satisfaction. The true measure of revenge is not in watching others stumble, but in refusing to be diminished, in cultivating power that flourishes independent of those who sought to contain it, and in leaving a legacy that speaks louder than any confrontation ever could. With the foundation of my influence firmly established, I turned my attention to legacy, the kind of impact that endures beyond immediate victories. I began documenting my experiences, not as a memoir, but as a framework for others who had faced similar exclusion, dismissal, or underestimation. Each chapter highlighted a principle: observation before action, patience as strategy, and decisive engagement when opportunity presented itself. My former in-laws remained a shadow in the background, their influence diminished by the very patterns they had cultivated. I no longer monitored their struggles actively, but their decline was evident to anyone paying attention. Leadership without listening, authority without insight, these were flaws that inevitably erode power. I encountered former employees, once silent observers in meetings I had been banned from, now seeking mentorship. They wanted to learn how to navigate exclusion, how to convert dismissal into advantage, how to transform subtle setbacks into long-term leverage. Their questions were familiar, echoing the lessons I had learned firsthand. And in guiding them, I realized that the reach of my influence extended far beyond what I had initially imagined. The moments of exclusion, which had once felt like punishment, were now the tools I shared with others to help them succeed. My ex-husband, too, continued to seek guidance, this time not as a partner, but as a colleague who had learned the value of insight, strategy, and recognizing when authority is hollow. Our conversations became analytical, focused on problem-solving rather than emotion. It was a civil and constructive dynamic, reflecting the growth of both of us. Perhaps the most profound realization came when I recognized the ultimate lesson: the people who tried to ban me from the room had inadvertently prepared me for a life of independent influence. They thought they were suppressing a voice. In reality, they were cultivating a strategist, a leader, and a guide who could operate far beyond the constraints of their hierarchy. The final irony was unmistakable: exclusion, intended to weaken, had empowered. Silence, intended to diminish, had sharpened. And the opportunities denied had instead created a path to authority and impact that no one could revoke. True revenge, I understood fully now, was not in humiliation or retribution, it was in transformation. It was in rising so fully and deliberately that your absence becomes a force more powerful than any presence you were once denied. By this stage, my influence had extended beyond the immediate professional sphere. Invitations came from industries I had never considered, opportunities to consult, advise, and shape organizations that valued insight above hierarchy. Each engagement reinforced a truth I had learned painfully early on: authority is fleeting if it relies solely on tradition, and influence is enduring when it is earned through competence and clarity. My former in-laws' company continued to deteriorate. Attempts to maintain control were increasingly futile. Every decision, unchecked by the very perspectives they had once dismissed, created gaps that compounded over time. Contracts were lost, key talent departed, and the market began to take note. Yet, I did not rejoice. My satisfaction was not in witnessing failure, it was in recognizing the inevitable consequences of choices that ignore merit. Occasionally, my ex-husband would reference situations in his work, asking for perspective. He no longer sought validation or approval. He wanted insight, understanding, and strategy. I provided it when appropriate, never with condescension, always with clarity. In these exchanges, I found a kind of closure I had not anticipated. It was neither triumphal nor vindictive. It was simple acknowledgement of growth, understanding, and perspective earned through experience. I also mentored a growing network of young professionals who had been underestimated or dismissed. Their questions echoed the lessons I had internalized. How do you act when your voice is ignored? How do you gain influence without permission? How do you convert exclusion into advantage? Each time I answered, I realized that my story had become larger than me. It was no longer only about reclaiming my place, it was about teaching others to navigate environments that might seek to silence them. Perhaps the most profound revelation came quietly, in reflection. The barriers imposed upon me had not been obstacles, they had been catalysts. They forced me to develop clarity, patience, and strategy. They demanded that I cultivate authority without relying on permission. And in doing so, they created a version of me capable of influence far beyond what those barriers had intended. The ultimate revenge, I now fully understood, is not spectacle, humiliation, or retribution. It is transformation, rising beyond limitation, cultivating enduring influence, and leaving behind a legacy defined not by those who tried to suppress you, but by the strength and reach of your independent voice. The final chapters of this journey were less about conflict and more about mastery. I no longer measured my worth by approval, proximity, or inclusion. My authority was intrinsic, rooted in competence, foresight, and deliberate action. Opportunities came not because I sought them, but because my presence carried value. Recognition, when it arrived, was a byproduct of consistent performance, not spectacle. The legacy of my former in-laws' exclusion became increasingly apparent, not through their words, but through outcomes. Their empire, once seemingly invincible, faltered under the weight of decisions made without insight. Patterns they had ignored for years, the very patterns I had warned about, surfaced relentlessly. Yet, I observed all of it with calm detachment. There was no gloating, no vindictive satisfaction. The lesson was clear: systems built on exclusion are inherently fragile. Influence cannot be contained by seating arrangements or hierarchy. It thrives in environments that value insight, courage, and clarity. My mentorship work reached new heights. I guided leaders, executives, and young professionals to recognize invisible barriers, navigate exclusion, and convert obstacles into opportunities. Every story I shared, every strategy one taught, carried the implicit proof that exclusion is not the end of influence, it can be the beginning of mastery. Even my ex-husband acknowledged this transformation, quietly and without fanfare. He recognized that influence does not come from proximity to power, but from the strategic cultivation of skill, vision, and presence. Our conversations became a rare blend of mutual respect and professional insight, devoid of the personal tension that had once defined us. And finally, the most profound realization emerged: the people who tried to silence me, to ban me from rooms, to diminish my voice, they had inadvertently created the conditions for my rise. Every denial, every act of exclusion, every moment of dismissal had taught me patience, clarity, and strategy. They had sharpened my instincts, refined my judgment, and revealed a power that could not be contained. The ultimate revenge, the lasting victory, was not in watching them fail. It was in rising fully, deliberately, and independently, building influence and legacy that no exclusion could undermine. It was in becoming unbreakable, unstoppable, and undeniable. The tables they had closed were no longer relevant. I had built my own, open, expansive, and lasting, a table where insight is valued, where voices are heard, and where authority is earned. And in that truth, I found the most powerful conclusion of all: exclusion can shape you, rejection can refine you, and silence can give birth to a voice so strong that it defines its own world.